Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And this is going to be a Malazan video. Unfortunately, I'm still behind on my schedule for what I was meant to be doing with Philip, which was Dust of Dreams. Do apologize for that. Life happened at the start of this year, and there were a number of things sort of came up, and it threw my schedule out the window. But I'm getting back on track now. But this video is actually, it's going to be a little bit about Warrens and a little bit about chapter 1 of Gardens of the Moon. And it seems very, very strange because obviously there's not a lot of overlap between those two topics. But while, and I know there are a lot of very good videos on the subject of the Warrens of the Malazan works. And they go into a lot of the detail about what the different Warrens are, how they work, all of these sorts of things. They go into very specific detail. But for me, I wanted to suggest just a different way of thinking about them, because in taking what I'm going to suggest is a slightly different approach, I think that lends itself to the almost the ethos or the approach that you can take to reading the Malazan series that actually opens up a lot of the information and prepares you for how to understand what's going on in Malazan, because a lot of people find reading Malazan to be difficult. And for the most part, I disagree. And it has nothing to do with being smart. It has nothing to do with having a better vocabulary than anyone else or anything like that. It has to do with understanding that Malazan is not written in the way that you might expect. And what I mean by this is, in modern genre fantasy, a lot of the predominant modes of the storytelling that is employed in the genre is very much focused on telling you what is happening, then explaining it to you. But the Malazan Book of the Fallen, in particular, is written in a short story form, even if in terms of format, it is very, very long. And the reason this is important is short story writing is not just a story that happens to be short. There are definite techniques that are employed in short story writing that are far less common in novels. And I suppose the easiest way to explain this is, because short stories are so concise, every single word has to do multiple things. It does double duty in a lot of different ways, because it's not just about the surface level of information, it's also about connotations, how those connotations build to create atmosphere and convey or imply additional information. So a sentence is, yes, telling you what happened in the sentence, but the word choice has to then convey additional information that is not necessarily apparent on the surface level of what the words mean. And this is because the concision of short stories means that you're trying to pack as much information as possible into what is on the page. Every single word you're trying to get the most out of. Whereas with novel writing, because novels tend to be much more expansive, there is less of a focus on trying to make every single sentence like that. There's almost a relaxation that you can spend a couple of sentences describing something instead of implying it. And when you read short stories a lot, when you read a lot of this, or literary fiction that employs this technique, one of the things that you come across is the understanding of how using word choice in various sentences, even though they're not related to that sentence, are actually building in different ways. And usually it's in terms of abstract, in terms of concept, or in terms of theme, and using connotations as a way to complete almost a secondary level of information. And this is where I am going to return to Warrens. So I'm not explaining Warrens the way that a lot of other people have done. I don't need to. Other people have already done it. But people when they look at warrens, when there's this sort of what is a warren? How does it work? The first thing we have to think of is, why do we need to know what it is that a warren is doing? And part of that, again, is a movement in modern genre fantasy away from magic being numinous, magic being this additional power, be it ethereal or unknowable or something mysterious. That magic has moved from that toward what we typically call now a magic system. We've systematized it. And the word system in that is actually very, very important, because it's implying a preference for a mechanical bias in how magic should be constructed. And quite often it's a movement away from the concept of what magic is toward an articulation of what magic is actually doing, because it's looking at the mechanism, it's looking at the recreatable effects. So understanding, this is what magic is and this is how it is used, these are the effects that you can create. And it's looking at it as a system. And that then leans into why, particularly in a lot of modern fantasy, there's a preference for what we typically call hard magic, because hard magic has very overt, knowable, understandable rules that are made explicit to the reader. Soft magic, on the other hand, may not have those rules, or the author may know those rules, but has not made them explicit to the reader. And soft magic is much closer to the original concept of a lot of how magic was used in fantasy writing up until relatively recently, whereas there's been this movement toward the magic in fantasy being mechanized, being systematized. And I would always argue that this is the influence of role-playing games on the genre and of computer games on the genre. And that approach of having recreatable effects and having to have rules that allow you to replicate feats and that are understandable to players. And that cross-pollination has actually added to the genre, and it's become very popular in the genre. But that's not the only way to think about it. Thinking about magic, if we go back in time a little bit, was much more about it as an abstract, as a concept. And this is where it ties directly into warrens. While Esselmont and Erikson gamed this, while it started out as D&D and then became GURPS, a lot of what they did was not focus and fixate on the mechanics of something, but rather the abstract notions and concepts of it. And when we think of the warrens, instead of looking at the surface level details that are creating an individual magic system and trying to understand it in a vacuum, if we think about it conceptually, because if I said to you elemental magic, earth, air, fire, water, or, if you're in Wheel of Time, spirit added in as well, we are very, very familiar with the concept of elemental magic, of having these different elements that you can draw aspects of their power, weave it into different forms to create effects. So fire as an element does not necessarily mean it's just about setting fire to things. It could be about warming. It could be about life or light. It could be combined with earth to create lava, or like all of these different effects, thinking about it in terms of abstract and concept. And in D&D, in a lot of these role-playing games and computer games, the idea that the realm of fire exists as a sort of metaphysical or magical plane of existence. We see it in Farron, where each of the gods rules over a metaphysical plane that can be visited if you have the power to do so. And drawing forth from that gives you access to that elemental power. So if we think of elemental planes, and then we change the name Realm of Fire to Tilan, or Realm of Ice to Omtos Falak, suddenly we have a conceptual basis for what a warren is, a metaphysical plane that is focused on one particular element. Now, obviously in the Malazan world, you then take that concept, that abstract notion, that generalized idea, and you start adding in and refining it with the surface level detail. So instead of calling it the realm of ice, it is Omtos Falak. There's one superficial or surface level change. Instead of it just being ice, it then gets added nuance being associated with the jagged and various other things. And then we think about it's called a warren instead of a realm. But all of those are very much just changing the tags, changing the labels on something and not changing the thing itself. So for me, warrens are actually very understandable and not confusing in the slightest, because so much of it is actually based on a concept of elemental power. And then when we think of, oh, but you can travel through certain warrens and not through others. But if we think of elements, there are elements that our mortal shells are more comfortable interacting with than others. I can hold an ice cube in my hand. I really would rather not hold a flame in my hand. And so when we think of traveling through warrens, if these are realms that are sort of kind of overlaid over the world, and depending on your perception or your how you are attuned to it or any of these sorts of things, that when you access it, the idea of traveling through it, but traveling through an ice landscape, you can bundle up. You can wear a hat and a coat and gloves and thick boots, and you can kind of survive there for a while in an ice realm. But if it's a fire realm, that's much more difficult for our mortal shells to survive in. We can survive on the surface of a water realm, but trying to inhabit inside the water realm, we'd be crushed by the pressure. Earth, we can travel alongside the earth, on top of the earth. But again, traveling through it requires a different form of travel. So when we think in the Malazan world about why some realms are more easily accessible, more readily used to travel, we have to think about it in terms of, well, yes, we are mortals traveling on elemental planes. Which planes are antithetical to our existence? Which planes can we sort of survive in? Which planes are fine for us to walk in? And that, again, just thinking of that as a general concept without getting into the nitty gritty, without getting down into the detail, you can understand why, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And after that, you use those specific references, that surface level detail, the nuance, to create a more complex individual picture of what these realms are and what they do and how warrens and magic function in the Malazan world. But starting with the concept, understanding the abstract, makes it a lot easier. And the reason I bring this up, and I'm going to go through this very quickly because I know this video is going on longer than I'd intended. But I wanted to look at the first scene in chapter 1 of Gardens of the Moon. And the reason I wanted to look at this, I've done videos before where I've talked about atmosphere, about how the repetition or use of certain types of words, not necessarily just the same word, but certain types of words, creates an atmosphere, a tone. But it can also lead to an expectation. And if we go through the first scene of Gardens of the Moon, the number of times that death and aspects of death and war and violence, all of those images and words are used, creates an atmosphere of impending doom and death and warriors and all of this sort of stuff. There are all of these, and it's not any one thing. It is a melange, a compilation of a general sort of abstract feeling. But within that, there's a specificity to the words and a recurrence of certain words that not only goes to the atmosphere and the tone and the style, but goes to what is happening on the page, and then goes to theme and things that are occurring elsewhere. So what I mean by this is in the prologue, we see the pogrom, the annihilation of mages in Lycene City, in Malaz City, with Lycene having ordered this. And that's important. So the first act that we see of the empire is them slaughtering their own citizens. The next act that we see of the empire in the first scene of chapter 1 is of an old woman and a young girl watching soldiers sort of ride by, and the old woman being mean to the young girl, but then a soldier lean down and kill the old woman in quite a brutal, offhand fashion. So again, the very first two instances we see of the actions of the empire create an incredibly negative impression, not only of soldiers, but of the empire itself. And because so much of the series focuses on soldiers and characters, and we get to know them, we get to like them, we sometimes overlook that this is not about a veneration and celebration of empire. It is very critical of the empire from the very beginning. But the thing that I want to bring up here, I've just got 2 slides where I've taken excerpts from scene 1 of chapter 1. And I'm going to go through things to do with Riga and things to do with the Fisher Girl to show how a lot of this stuff sort of lines up. So as you can see, instead of going through a complete reading of the entire section, although you can go and do that, and I think you'll find a lot of these things, but I've picked out just a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here. So we see that I've picked out some important things that I will link to later on, but also some repetition things. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of repetition is that second sort of highlighted in red. She leaned to one side and spat. And then later on, we're told, who'd roast the bastard soul on a spit? Now, this is a repetition of basically the word spit, past tense and present tense. But obviously, the second instance there, who'd roast the bastard soul on a spit, it's talking about a different form, a different meaning of the word spit. That's not talking about the action of spitting. It's talking about a roasting spit, which is obviously a different thing. So the surface level information, the overt information that is being told to us is different in both instances. But there is a connection between the two. And because of that connection, because this is in that short story style, this is the kind of thing that you are meant to pick up on, that the author has placed in very deliberately the use of a curse, an epithet. Who'd roast the bastard soul on a spit? There are so many other ways that that could have been expressed by the author. Erikson could have written any form of made-up curse or any form of made-up swear, but chose to emphasize the word spit. And so because of that, because of this intentionality, because of this short story style of writing, it creates a connection between these two things. And therefore, in your head, you remember already seeing the previous word, well, spat in this case, in the specific, but you remember already seeing that on the page. And then when we move down again, there's a line that reads, the old woman spat a second time. So there's an explicit reference of this recurrence, this action happening again. It's drawing your attention to it. Authors typically don't have a lot of repetition in what characters do and say. Usually when they put in repetition, it's to draw your attention and your focus to something. And so the repetition of spat is highlighted, it is deliberate, it is there for a reason. And the reason this becomes important is, if you look, it starts with prod and pull, and then there is the action of she spat. If we go to if we now go to some of the things about the young fisher girl, we find if we look at this end at the very bottom of this, she straightened, her eyes suddenly hard, then deliberately spat on the road. Prod and pull, the fisher girl said quickly. And so here we have where it started with Riga saying prod and pull and then spitting. Now we think of it almost as a mirror, because now there's the spitting and then the fisher girl says prod and pull. So there is a deliberate mirroring of these things. So not only do we have the repetition, but the order and sequencing in which they are is a mirror. And we then think, if mirroring is something that is going on, with this concept of mirroring, we have an old woman and a young woman or young girl. And so we see again the old woman starts and then it ends with the young girl. That there is a sort of mirroring, but this time it's been changed slightly. And if we go back to the things that I'd highlighted with Riga, thus we are linked, you and I, beyond all else. And then I skip forward a wee bit. Bury this deep. Riga will preserve you because we are linked, you and I. So look at how that phrasing, thus we are linked, you and I, and then we are linked, you and I. Again, deliberate repetition of phrase. And now we have an overt reference to, an overt description of Riga talking about being linked to the young fisher girl. So we have not only prod and pull and spitting being old woman first, fisher girl second, the mirroring, all of these links are there in other aspects. And then we are explicitly told that they are linked. And so we have explicit surface level information, we have structurally linked them, we have conceptually linked them, there's repetition of actions and words drawing the two together. And then when looking at the fisher girl section again, the elements from the fisher girl's perspective that I wanted to talk about. The fisher girl screamed as Riga landed heavily across her thighs. A thread of crimson spit spattered her face. Now, it's slightly ambiguous here. Is the thread of crimson spit spattering across Riga's face as she falls over? Or more likely, is it that a thread of crimson spit, combining both blood and spit, has come from Riga onto the fisher girl, a transference of spit, of blood. And then we think of spit again being emphasized. And again, this thing that is very heavily associated with Riga at the beginning, the spit has moved from Riga onto the fisher girl. We have the line where Riga had said that they are linked. Here is a physical link between the two. Riga is landing across her body, so there's a physical point of connection. And then there's this sort of metaphysical, abstract, the blood of Riga arriving and forming a connection with the fisher girl on her face. Then we have, never mind the candles, she mumbled in a thick, odd voice. But at the end of that, we have, when she spoke again, her voice was young and normal. So again, the thick, odd voice at the start, and then the normal voice at the end. So if you think of the structure that we've already talked about, Riga at the start, fisher girl at the end, the Riga saying that they are joined, that they are connected, that they are one. And here we have, never mind the candles, candles being associated with Riga. She mumbled in a thick, odd voice. So why is this not her normal voice? Then when she spoke again, her voice was young and normal. And that's when she talks and goes to the twine associated with the young fisher girl. So there's that dichotomy of the two different actions, the two different focuses, the old woman associated with candles and being slightly odd, and the young woman associated with the fisherman and the fishing basket. Here it comes then, the girl greeted softly in a voice that wasn't her own. And here we have what was suggested and implied in that previous section I talked about. It is again made overt here. Here it comes then, the girl greeted softly in a voice that wasn't her own. If it's not her voice, whose is it? She straightened, her eyes suddenly hard, then deliberately spat on the road. Prod and pull, the fisher girl said quickly. So you can see, even though it never once says in any of this that Riga has possessed the fisher girl, it is absolutely in the text that Riga has possessed the fisher girl. It is there structurally. It is there with surface level information and detail. It is there in the mirroring of their words and actions. It is there in the voices that are used. And none of this has actually even discussed what the mysterious figures say about Riga as a corpse, where they mention her magic. And we've seen all of the aspects of death magic associated with her, with these candles, that they make explicit and explain to the reader that the candles contain souls, that Riga was a necromancer, that Riga played with and bound souls and spirits. And so when that information is explicitly added in, and when we are told she had one more trick to play, one more thing that she could have done, the reader becomes aware that this is the trick that she did. And none of this is set up to be a sudden reveal. All of this is set up as implied information, contextual information, thinking about things in terms of symbolism and abstract and concept, and looking at the surface level information that then shapes those nebulous constructs into something definitive. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. This idea that when we are reading Malazan, one of the reasons it sometimes can feel complicated to some people is the over-reliance we have now on reading surface level information and expecting that information to be everything that we need to know. And yet that is only one style of storytelling. That short storytelling quite often uses and plays with multiple other forms of these concepts and abstracts, where the surface level information is only one dimension of the information, and there are other dimensions there to be had, that you have to be aware of structure, that you have to be aware of mirroring of actions and words, where you have to be aware of connotations and subtext, that all of those things actually shape nebulous constructs into the definitive information that we need. So I hope that you've enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one.